We are being swept up in a whirlwind of change in every single area of our life, and nowhere is this more prevalent than in selling. Because basically selling is interwoven with everything we do from the time we're children to the time we die. And selling has been affected by change as much or more than any other single factor in our society. And you know, in every single field, there are those who change early, those who change later, those who change much later, those who never change at all. And in selling, we find those who are at the head of their field are the ones who have glommed onto, either understood intuitively the changes that have taken place in the market and made their changes so that they were coextensive or coexistent with it, or they have just let them go by. So therefore, if you want to be one of the top people, you have to sell like the top people. And in the last few years, we've done tens of thousands of studies of actual sales call, interviewing the salespeople before, interviewing the customer in advance, interviewing both of them afterwards, watching what happened, videotaping the conversations, to find out exactly what takes place in a conversation between the best salespeople and their prospective customers, and what takes place in a conversation between those who are not particularly successful. And now we know the answers. So let's start with the basics. The basic change that has taken place is that sales have moved from the simple to the complex. Now, when we say simple, a simple sale was a sale that had a single call. You called on the customer, you made a presentation, you went through attention, interest, desire, action. Those were the 4 steps of the old model, the AIDA model. And you made a sale and you left, and you didn't have to see the customer again. The product was delivered from your company, the billing was done by someone else. We call this a touch-and-go sale. There was a single decision maker, single person that you spoke to. There was a single decision to be made. There was a single check. It was a pretty simple thing, and touch-and-go, lock and load, hit and run, and we were on our way. This still, by the way, is the method that is often used in selling things door-to-door. We often use this method in selling small products that are relatively unsophisticated to customers who are relatively knowledgeable and who can make the decision. And so therefore there's a lot of room for this in our society, but as customers have become more knowledgeable, more intelligent, more complicated, more sophisticated, more demanding, tougher, more ruthless, less loyal, and so on, we've entered into the era of what we call the complex sale. Now the complex sale is very different. The complex sale has a series of calls. And there's 3, and there's 4, and of course, according to the recent studies, it takes about 5 calls on a qualified prospect to make a sale. And these have multiple calls and multiple decision makers. Competition is involved. A variety of different factors. Politics rears its ugly head within the organization. Price and service demands are far greater than they were before. It takes longer to make a sale, and at every stage of the sale is a possibility of losing it. And once the sale is made, the sale goes on and goes on and goes on after the sale. So therefore, once you make a sale, there's call number 6 and call number 7 and call number 8. The sale is not over simply because you've made it. This requires a totally different approach to selling. Now here's what we know, is we know that in the old selling, when customers were relatively unsophisticated, the old model of selling was used. Now this old model of selling, which I'll show you, was almost like sort of like a triangle. In the old model of selling, which was developed in the 20s and 30s and perfected and put into sales courses in the 40s and 50s, taught in the 60s, became less effective in the 70s, became invalid in the 80s, is dead in the 90s. And yet there are a tremendous number of people who were taught this way. This is how I was taught old model. And there's a lot of people who still teach old model. The problem is that old model doesn't work unless you're selling very simple, unsophisticated products to relatively unsophisticated people. Now here's the old model. The old model had 4 parts of the sale. The first part was 10%, establishing rapport. And I remember being told, when you establish rapport, you get right down to the purpose of your business. Don't waste time, and don't waste the customer's time. So you say, hi, how are you? How you doing? Let's get right down to business. You'd come in with an opening sentence that would grab the person's attention, the AIDA model, and you would immediately start selling. The second part of the old model, 20% of the sale, was qualifying. And we were told, find out if they got the money before you waste any time with them. So you'd go in, and the very first thing you'd say is, Mr. Prospect, if I could show you exactly what you're looking for, are you in a position to make a buying decision right now without reference to a third party? In other words, you would qualify to make sure they had the money and could make the decision before you even went to the third step. Now, the third step was presenting. And presenting was a whole series of verbal techniques where you rolled your eyes and lifted your voice up and down and modulated and leaned forward and mirrored and matched and did all these tricks to manipulate a person into talking them out of the money that you had determined that they had in phase 2. In the presenting phase, You basically did a dog and pony show to get them to be interested enough in your product so you were ready to kick the long ball or go in for the kill. And the last 40% of the old model was closing. And we were told buyers are liars, so close them early and often. And if you want to see an example of this method of selling, you can take your children to what we call a museum of prehistoric selling art, and you take them to a used car lot on a side street in a poor part of town, and you will see that the Neanderthals who come out of the rocks in the back of the yard to address you were all taught this method by people who were taught this method by people who were taught this method. The fact is that sophisticated customers today, if you try to use this method, they will laugh at you. They actually think you're a joke because it's so insulting as to be almost funny that a person would try to use it. Unfortunately, many people were taught on this. So this is the old model of selling. The model is largely invalid today. Today's products are so much more complicated that something else has changed. And what has changed is this, is that customers cannot evaluate what is in your product. They can't evaluate the components. They can't evaluate the ingredients. They don't know about your service and how good it will be. They don't know anything, so they're looking for some way to get a hold on whether or not they should do business with you. And we know this. Number one is the decision to buy today, the decision to buy, because the sale goes on after the sale, represents entering into a long-term relationship. When you ask a customer to make a decision, to make a buying decision, to buy a product that will have to be serviced and followed up on and so on, you are really proposing business marriage. You are saying, please marry us, my company, and we will take care of you for the foreseeable future. Now, up to now, when you've been making calls, you've been dating. And now you're suggesting a long-term commitment. And now the customer has to say, it's fine to go dating with you, but do I want to get married to you? And do I want to become dependent? And the critical factor here is the word dependency. You see, up to now, the customer has been doing fine. The customer can take you or leave you. The customer can buy or not. But if they buy from you, then they now become dependent upon you to fulfill the promises that you made in the course of your sales presentation. We know that, by the way, the importance of the relationship, the long-term relationship, starts off very high here. When the conversation begins, it goes underground like an underground river, underground water. During the conversation, it is assumed. And then at the end of the sales conversation, it comes back to the top and is the critical factor in determining whether the prospect buys. So the second thing we know is that the customer wants a relationship first. The customer wants a relationship first. So salespeople, the top salespeople today, are those who concentrate on building the relationship, which goes back to talking about the importance of consulting and asking questions and so on. The customer wants to know that they can have confidence in you to fulfill your commitments. When you ask a customer to buy today, do you know what you're really asking? What you're asking is that the customer give you real live money that you can take to the bank and cash in the form of a check, and in exchange you will give the customer a promise that you will deliver on the products or services the customer is buying. So you're asking people for real money on which their careers and futures hang in exchange for promises. Just between you and I, this is a very tough sell to sell promises for money, because your promises are what we call air promises. They're in the air until the customer actually has and enjoys what you're selling. So it's important that the customer, in order for the customer to engage in this, the customer wants a relationship. The customer cannot figure out what's in your product, but they can figure out what's in you. So we find today that all selling today is relationship selling. All successful salespeople are relationship salespeople. And they have the relationship in the forefront of their mouth. And the relationship today is more important than the product or service. It's more important than the product or service. Now here's something I have to tell you, which will come as a shock to you with regard to the product or service, but it is available elsewhere. Your product or service can be found somewhere else. The customer today doesn't have to buy what you have to sell. The customer can get something pretty similar to it somewhere else at a pretty similar price. So therefore, the customer has no sense of urgency. You don't have a monopoly situation. The customer is not under pressure. So therefore, the customer feels that the relationship is more important, because they can get the product or service anywhere, but the relationship they can only get with you. In fact, one of the very best closing lines, which I've heard, which is very good, is the customer says, look, I can get this several places. Why should I buy it from you? And you say, Mr. Customer, because along with the product or service, you get me thrown into the deal at no extra charge. is you cannot get me thrown into any other deal. You can buy any other product or service, but along with this, you get me. And I will give you my personal assurance that you will be happy and you'll be satisfied when you buy this product or service from me. Aside and apart, on top of whatever assurances my company gives, I give you my personal assurance that you will be satisfied and happy. Well, when you do this, you activate what we call the law of indirect effort. Now, the law of indirect effort, and by the way, when you talk about selling is a form of human interaction, and virtually every principle that applies to selling applies to relationships with other human beings. And the law of indirect effort is the law of relationships. It applies to relationships with the people you love and the people that you meet and so on. It says this. It says, if this is you, and this is the sale. Well, if you concentrate, let me get a pen here. If you concentrate directly on making the sale, you'll likely be unsuccessful. However, over here is the relationship. If you concentrate instead on the relationship, then what you'll do is you'll make the sale like one bounce in the corner pocket, or one bank in the corner pocket. So what do top salespeople do? Is they go into a sales situation where the customer is primed. And let me ask you a question. Do customers like salespeople?
No.
Why?
They have no relationship.
They have no relationship, but also they associate salespeople with talking them into buying something they don't want, don't need, can't use, can't afford, which won't work and won't be serviced afterwards. Because why? Because they've had that experience. Just like all people who buy things have had bad buying experiences, and here you are to offer them another one. So the initial approach to you as a salesperson is negative, resistant. There'll always be high levels of resistance at the beginning of any sales conversation. That's why you say, Mr. Prospect, I'm not here to sell you anything. All I want to do is I want to ask you a couple of questions about what you're doing and see if there isn't a cost-effective way that we can help you improve your life or your work. But I really see myself as a consultant, not as a salesperson. For instance, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions about so-and-so and start asking questions. As soon as you start asking questions, you position yourself as a consultant, not a salesperson. As soon as you start talk about your product, you position yourself as a salesperson. The guards and defenses all come up, the shields go out, like on the Enterprise, and the customer bristles, like the porcupine's bristles come out, and you're swimming upstream. That's a whole series of mixed metaphors. So your job is to concentrate on the relationship, but the very best salespeople just concentrate on the relationship. I've read studies of top negotiators, and the one characteristic of top negotiators is they're very easygoing, very low-key, very friendly, very problem-focused, and very concerned about the relationship more than they are about the issues involved in the negotiation at the beginning. So if you concentrate on the relationship like one bank, the sale will take care of itself. If you go aggressively after the sale, you'll actually drive the customer away. And if you go aggressively after the sale, the customer will not see you again. And this has led to, as a result of all the research, the development of what we call the new model of selling. Now, this new model of selling is extremely powerful. The new model of selling, well, here was the old model of selling. Let me just erase it. What has happened is the old model of selling flipped over, and we had a Poseidon adventure. And we now have the new model of selling, which is like this. And the new model of selling also has 4 levels of the sales process. And the 4 levels are divided as 40% is the first level, 30% of the sales process is the second level, 20% is the third level, 10% is the fourth level. Now, this is a very good model to have in mind because it helps you see where you are and where you're going. The first 40% of the new model of selling is trust. We know that this is true because we know that all relationships of all kind are based on trust. Relationships with our family, relationships with our employers, relationships with our friends, the people that we love, everything is based on trust. The one thing that you can never shatter in a relationship, if you want to keep the relationship, is the trust between the two people. The trust is the foundation for respect, for esteem, for love, for warmth, for confidence, and everything else. So trust is the critical factor. And therefore, all top salespeople realize the very first thing that you do in a sales relationship is you concentrate on building trust. Because all customers have been burned and all customers had negative experiences, and before they can go to the next step with you, they must trust you. Well, how do you develop trust? Well, the second level of the new model of selling is needs. And the way that you develop trust is you ask questions about the customer's needs and you listen to the answers. And as you ask questions and listen to the answers, the customer trusts you more. As the customer trusts you more, they will be more open to answering your questions about their needs. And as you ask them more questions about their needs, they will trust you more, and you will get onto what we call an upward spiral, where the relationship gets better and better rather than a downward spiral where it gets worse and worse. In fact, every good salesperson has had the experience of focusing the entire conversation on needs, and as a result of it, the customer at a certain point says, well, I'll take it, whatever it is. They just decide to buy it, and they will make a subtle psychological shift in the conversation where instead of being resistant, they will start looking for ways to help you to help them to buy. But what about this, and can you help me with that, and we need this, and so on. In other words, they will go around the table mentally, and they will be on your side helping you to help them structure the purchase offer, and if they have to get approval from someone else, they will help you go to that other person. They will tell you what you have to say, and so on. In other words, they will be pulling the sale through rather than you're pushing it through. And pull through is the key, and pull through is what comes from building trust. Now, what does this mean? If you look at these two, 40 plus 30 is, guess how much? 70%. It means you have to get to the 70% mark before you even start talking about your product or service. Many of the best salespeople will actually be in a position to begin wrapping up the sale. They'll be 70% of the way through the sale before the customer even knows what it is they're selling. Many salespeople never even mention their company. They just talk about what the product or service will do. The company, the product, the service becomes secondary to the earlier parts of the new model. Now, the third part of the new model, 20% of the sale, is presenting. And presenting is a very interesting part. And again, in study after study, this is what we found, is top salespeople take the time to match what their product does to the needs that have been mutually identified. Now, what do we mean by mutually identified? Well, there's this is a very powerful process in selling where you simply feed back what the customer said. You say, now let me make sure I understand exactly what you're saying. You're saying your concerns are this, and this is what happened in the past, and so on, and this is what you seem to be looking for, until the customer says, yes, you got it. Only then do you begin to present. You don't present because you assume, or you guess, or you hope you know. You confirm that you know. Think of it as a doctor. We have what we call the doctor selling model. Think of the doctor doing the examination, then coming back and saying, based on the tests and the exam and everything else, this is what seems to be the case. You seem to have these pains here. Is that correct? And the doctor does a double check on the symptoms and how long you've had it and so on. And based on this, the doctor then makes a recommendation. So the presentation is where you tie the product benefits and features skillfully into the needs that you've identified, but only those needs. You don't say, now, our product does 23 things, and although you've only mentioned 3 that are important to you, by gum, you're going to hear all 23. And many salespeople feel that they have to go through a pre-planned presentation, and they have to cover everything their product does. What we found is top salespeople focus on the 1 or 2 things that the customer is most concerned with. And the customer, by the way, there's what I consider to be a 90-10 rule in selling. The 90-10 rule says that 90% of the sales decision is going to be made on the basis of 10% of the features. That there's just something about it that the customer will hone in on and will continue to ask questions about and will be interested in and be fascinated by and will want to learn more about. You'll be able to tell. The customer, we call this the hot button. The customer will sort of be really interested in one part of what you're selling, and that's where you focus and show them overwhelmingly, show the customer that he or she will get that what they want with the product or service. Now, the last 10% is confirming. Now, confirming is, does this make sense to you? Is this what you had in mind? Would this be better than you're currently doing? Do you like what I've shown you so far? Is this the sort of thing that you like to do? And so on. And when you confirm, the customer says, yes, that makes sense, and so on, and then you simply close the sale. Now, notice this, is that if you do the first parts of the new model of selling, building trust, by identifying needs and feeding it back carefully, you've done 70% of the way. You've done most of the sale, and it gets easier and easier and easier as you get toward the bottom. The close is very easy in the new model. It falls off like an apple that is ripe. It just falls off. Now, you didn't, and in most cases you have to ask, how soon would you like to get started? The next step will be this. Would you like to have it delivered here or somewhere else? In other words, you have to ask a question that gives the customer an opportunity to say yes. But in many cases, the customer will say, well, okay, or how do I get started, or you need a check, or what do I sign? I mean, if you've done the presentation well, the sale will take care of itself quite naturally. Over here in the old model, what will happen is you'll have to learn and read the books that have 103 or 107 or heaven knows closing techniques, and you'll have to be closing all the time. In fact, one publisher in New York recently said, I would not publish a book that did not have a sales book that did not have the word close in the title, because all selling is closing. And this is old school. We know that it's not the case, but many people who are trained in old school believe that all selling is closing. And in fact, all selling is building trust by identifying needs and showing people how you can help them, ideally with your product or service, and then asking them if this makes sense to them and going up to wrap up the details. Well, this brings us to the great rule of selling, and the great rule is this. The great rule of all relationships is that listening builds trust. Listening builds trust. Listening builds trust. How do you build trust? You listen. How do you build trust? You ask questions and you listen. You ask questions, and when the prospect is answering, you listen attentively. You lean forward. You lean into the customer. You nod. You smile. You don't interrupt. And you focus. Every time the customer is talking, you get a chance to build trust. Even if the customer is objecting. It's the most remarkable thing when the customer objects and says, I don't like this, and I don't like that, and I don't like this, and and you nod, and you listen, and you take it in, and you don't defend, and you don't come back and everything. You're building trust. You'll find the very best salespeople expect customers to be resistant, and they just relax. As the sale goes on, they just relax. And they just listen. When you listen, you tell the customer you consider him or her to be important. When you listen, you actually build the customer's self-esteem. We find that people who are listened intensively to, their self-esteem goes up, as does their blood pressure and their respiratory rate. When you listen, you hear the customer better. When you listen, you show the customer that you are really considering the importance of what he or she has said. So listening builds trust. That's why all the best salespeople practice what we call the 70-30 rule. They listen 70% of the time or more. They talk 30% of the time or less. All poor salespeople have it in reverse. They go talk, 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 and whenever the customer says something, they jump in and go talk, 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 talk. Whereas the very best salespeople listen. We'll have entire sessions on listening later. Now this brings us to almost the final point in this session, which is what we call the friendship factor. Now the friendship factor is something I learned very early in selling, and I learned it, and once I learned it, I was never the same. It's so powerful, it's this. It is the discovery that a customer cannot buy from you until he or she feels genuinely that you are their friend and you care about them. You cannot buy from somebody you don't like, and you can't sell to somebody you don't like either. No matter what it is, if you don't have the right chemistry, it's like two ends of a magnet, north and south pole, pushing each other apart. But if you like each other, what will happen is you'll be attracted together. So therefore, the customer has to be convinced that you like them, and there are three keys to liking. They are time. Investing time in a sales relationship is one of the very best ways to build the trust that's necessary to make a sale. The second is caring, and the third is respect. Time, caring, and respect. When you ask people how they're feeling, it shows you that you care. When you come on time and you're polite to them, it shows you that you respect them. Time, caring, and respect build friendship. If you take these all together, the wonderful thing we know is that all top salespeople are relationship experts. All top salespeople read, study, learn, and practice continually, and their whole thought is, how can I build a better relationship? What are the things that I can do or say? And they get out of themselves, and they focus wholeheartedly, their whole mind and their whole heart on the other person. And they concentrate continually on building and maintaining high levels of trust. And surprise, surprise, the sales take care of themselves.